Hello all, and for this video I wanted to have a bit of a discussion about some of Aquinas's ideas of freedom and maybe rebuke some of my own thoughts on it that I've shared on the channel before. I have like a video called "And the Fruits to Bear Are So Much Sweeter Than Freedom." That's the one I can think of off the top of my head. And I think what I'm really getting at in that video perhaps is a kind of teleological understanding in an Aristotelian sense, but of course Aquinas was using Aristotelian ideas, so naturally they would create a kind of synthesis together. But I think if you really want to start this, we would have to go towards the way he sees the will and how that contrasts to the way we perceive the will now. And what I really mean by that is kind of the way in which the will and the intellect have a sort of interaction towards each other, where the will is kind of somewhat of that inner archetype that I talked about in the last video, the kind of the formal cause, if we want to be technical about it, but the kind of not just animal soul sensory way of examining, but more towards the actual how would I want to put this? And I think the best way is kind of, there's just some people, I think I would actually include myself into that, who, when I was a kid, and I've done my digital biography, when I was a kid, a lot of people just always assumed that I was going to be that kind of political, philosophical type of person. I was just that kind of abstract daydreamer, really from the start. And to me that kind of seems like a formal cause. Like I was always provoked. I was always kind of had this inkling towards these kind of abstract concepts, and to kind of see will as more than just one cause in the kind of grand schema, as opposed to just in this kind of vacuum of choice and free will, as it were, but actually adopting a teleological view that has the formal and end cause incorporated into it, or the final cause, as opposed to just the kind of here's the material, and then this is what we will use the material for to create something. The efficient cause for Aquinas here is the action upon the intellect, or the inkling, and so we have to use the intellect, use reason, and our understanding of knowledge through natural law, through observing other people and our experiences from that, is how we get towards particulars that are godlike. And you can see that with his virtues that he borrows from Plato himself: justice, wisdom, courage, and self-control, the golden median for Aristotle. This would be, at least in the within nature, within man's nature, towards the the highest conception of freedom that I talk about on this channel. But these kind of particulars, though, this emulation, Aquinas is always very weary of the idea that we can obscure the good, or definitely display the kind of fallenness that we see in Christian thought. and that obviously lays the door for idolatry. And I think that was one of the main points of my old video on freedom is ideology and the way it kind of treats freedom. It doesn't have that kind of final cause in the 21st century, and this is kind of replacing, God with the market, or psychology of that we see in science towards just really the justification for why it's acceptable to do these harmful things, and this kind of intermediate way of looking at, I suppose, the kind of intermediate good, the kind of the good decisions that you make on a daily basis. It's kind of like in an intermediate way towards the ultimate good. And the ultimate good can only be informed by the intellect. That's you overcoming sensory and whatnot. But this can be substituted pretty easily if you have this kind of vacuum conception of things. If you don't have a kind of teleological idea of freedom or choice, if you will, then all that's going to lead to is idolatry. Even if you're the embodiment of the kind of particulars that Plato is talking about, it's still idolatry, because it in other words, the kind of Christian explanation would be that you have a natural inkling towards these sort of cardinal virtues that Plato introduced in his work. But yeah, that could also lead into the idea of habit and the cultivation of natural law, and that it's what's written on the human heart. It's written in the will. This sort of provocation of what we think is good and aesthetic, and what we strive for in that kind of archetypical way that, of course, Aquinas would argue is the gift of God. And I think it's kind of interesting maybe to once again look at how, in the kind of Spenglerian sort of way of seeing, you have the kind of religious springtime stage going to the kind of philosophical stage, how here you can kind of see that the act of writing and going away from the kind of oral tradition. The oral tradition is much older, and so it's kind of interesting, or something that I've kind of picked up on trying to look at how you go from the kind of religious oral sort of philosophical understanding that's more kind of spontaneous in the kind of free way that Aquinas is really alluding to, the kind of spontaneous answer towards the will of the heart in the kind of archetype way. That's not really the way free will is seen today, and kind of the compartmentalization of all these different moral psychological attributes, right? Because what I think we're really trying to get at is will is the taming of, or well, not really necessarily the taming, but the kind of synthesis of emotion and the intellect itself, intelligence, or the way we apprehend knowledge, and the sort of animal-like will or cause in and of itself. These aren't separate things. You don't just have emotions leading, and then that kind of like goes up against your intelligence, and that goes up against your kind of sensory way of perceiving things. No, it's actually all three together, and they don't really just have this sort of expression of borders or anything like that. That, it could change, and I think that's really true if you've ever, been angry and your intellect got the best of you through your emotions. You couldn't really control them through the intellect. Your emotions took over, and I think that's a interesting way of seeing will and the kind of teleological worldview, this sort of higher freedom, and the kind of distinct change between being godlike and having the kind of divine law that Aquinas talks about. You have natural law, and out of natural law comes the kind of hierarchy of human law, the Roman state. But you also have the sort of divine law and the cause of logos. And we kind of talked about this in the video the other day about divine explanation instead of the kind of conspiratorial way of explaining things today, where we kind of talk about the elite class and how if you point, it's kind of like the old meme with the blackboard, and you just have all of the different connections, and that's certainly how it feels as someone who posts a lot of theory online. And but here with Aquinas, though, evil and the way things are, he kind of explains through intentionality and the kind of double intentions of the end of something, the teleological understanding of the ultimate good through God. And so you can only, sometimes when you have to, if that's going to be your primary intention, is to be godlike or saint-like or an Aristotelian philosopher, whatever the case may be, sometimes you have to do things in the kind of intermediary sense. And this is the kind of explanation of war and trying to find peace out of it. The ultimate good being, the return to peace, the end of the war. But in the meantime, you have to, kill your enemies and do what would be considered evil in that kind of immediate sense. But, in the telos, that's toward the final cause, if you will. And it's important to kind of see how efficient cause is played out as kind of habits in a way. You make these sort of day-to-day choices of what you perceive as good, and it's important. And in another explanation way of we kind of perceive intentionality of the good, but that doesn't always happen. In many cases, it definitely doesn't go right. You can make mistakes, and this is another kind of way of explanation, as opposed to this never-ending sort of paranoia kind of schizo-posting way we kind of explain ideological enemies, or what the elite class is doing, this kind of constant paranoia towards what the big man or the intermediate is doing ahead of us. But that's not really the case. And obviously this time period, as we're looking back, because the big man and authority kind of have a far more reconcilable relationship, because there is an actual telos to the big man is trying to bring out a kind of particulars of a good community, and that comes from the cultivation of good people. And the kind of end goal of trying to achieve that is totally lost today. And instead we have what we would consider, these kind of fallen aspects of all we can have is the sort of analogy of being godlike, but we can't actually tap into any of this knowledge in a greater hierarchical way of it's this will be a future video that I'll probably make, which maybe I should have made first, but the best way I've kind of been able to see his Aquinas's proofs of God, if you will, is not considering God itself as this kind of chain of existence, right? The kind of trying to find this sort of documentation of these different causes that led to human existence, but instead as asking a much more different question of the cause of that end in and of itself. Who even thought of existence in that sort of way? Who even not only just set it in motion, but why was it set in that particular way? And why are these particular goods what we intellectually end up finding? It's kind of funny that you have Platonic virtues here in medieval thought, right? Justice, wisdom, courage, self-control, these aren't exactly the most big-brained ideas perhaps in the world, but obviously the way they're articulated is very rich. But these are things that kind of feel quite literally written within the will of your heart in a kind of biblical sense. But this is just a small video that I really wanted to make as a kind of rebuke of maybe understanding that, I've talked of freedom before, and I think maybe some of us on the kind of dissident thinking political landscape is kind of, in a way, turned against the kind of concept of freedom because we don't really agree with the way it's conceptualized today, instead of kind of answering the call of freedom to do good as opposed to choosing to do good in and of itself. I think that's an actual distinction that's worth making. But thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys for the next video.